Welcome. In this video, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at Blade Runner by director Ridley Scott. And in this film, this is probably one of the most famous dystopian science fiction films of all time. And the reason for it is it's so iconic and it's so very deep thematically, and it's quite a rich film. Now, on the surface, it might just appear to be an ordinary action film when you first watch it. But if you go a bit deeper and you look into it, you actually find there are a lot of connections between not only the world at the time, and certainly the ideas and issues around scientific knowledge at that particular point in time, but also there's this sort of sense now that a lot of the things which have occurred in Blade Runner, not all of them obviously, but some of the things are mirroring our own societal problems. So, when you're looking at this text, you'd be looking at sort of not only what's happening in it, and certainly the rich and deep themes that are current throughout the text, but you'll also be looking at the world around it and the sorts of things that have been influencing it. So to start with, it was first shown in 1982. Now, this was the original theatrical release. It didn't do massively well. It was opened on a tough weekend in the box office, and was criticised at the time. It was polarising with critics in the sense that some absolutely loved it, thought it was very deep and thematic. Some people thought that it was too slow and didn't really capture the hearts and minds of the audiences. And certainly it's one of the ones that's only really sort of picked up in later years after the original film's released, that the film has actually got the recognition that it probably deserved to start with. It also helped that in 1992, the director's cut was released, which is the version that you'd be normally looking at. And certainly there are not many people who actually look at the theatrical version. We mainly look at now at the director's cut because of the fact that the director's cut is really a far superior version of the film. And the final cut is a remastered version of the original director's cut. So it's just in higher definition. That's basically it. So those two releases are the main ones you'd be looking at. You won't necessarily be looking at the 1982 release. In fact, you probably won't be. And the reason for that is there are a number of key differences, and it's not quite as deep as the director's cut version is. So that's the reason why we look at that one. Okay. These versions also have a different ending, which makes it a little bit hard to talk about, and particularly the fact that the director's cut has a far more significant ending and a far more important ending than probably what the original one had. So this is why we mainly focus on studying the director's cut version, and why we focus on those images as opposed to the ones in the original version. Okay, so let's just look basically at the setting of the film first, and look at some main plot elements of the story. And then later on we'll look at some of the ideas that come out of the context of the film, so come out of it being shot in 1982, and some things which are quite inherent of a film that is filmed in the 1980s. And also have a look at some of the other things which have influenced the film and its production. So basically those things that you see in 1982 Los Angeles, and things that you would probably see if you have a look at it now. Okay, what we have here is in 2019, so it's, in our case, probably not a very distant future away, and probably our 2019 is not going to look like this. However, it's an overpopulated and heavily polluted Los Angeles. It's also a hellish, homogenized world where neon lights and Asian influences dominate the landscape. So it's considering that, and there was this paranoia going around, particularly at the time, that there was this fear that Asian culture was going to take over the world. And in doing so, the way that Asian culture is shown here is it's basically shown as being in the really seedy parts of town. Now, this is one of those things that it sort of comes out of I guess what people thought the future would be like looking at from 1982. However, it's one of those things where you can sort of see the rise of globalization, and particularly multiculturalism, which is somewhat shown off in this film. Although if you're looking at it from the original couple of scenes and a couple of takes, you probably won't think of that too much, and you mainly be focusing on the sort of darkness and bleakness of the setting, and that's definitely probably the most dominant feature. There's also signs advertising off-world colonies, which indicate that there's basically a class system, that the world, humanity has populated new worlds, so we've gone to other planets. It's indicated that society has changed where the rich are able to live away from the basically the hellish environment, and the poor are forced to live in very squalid old cities. which often have things like flames rising out of the landscape and all those sorts of things. Okay, so let's just go through the story of the film and just basically go through some main plot points. And in the case that if you're a little bit stuck on it, then this would be just a very quick rundown for you. And we're not going to go through the whole thing start to finish, we're just going to go through the main points. So Deckard is basically a retired Special Forces police officer called a Blade Runner. And what his job was to do was to hunt down replicants, who are artificial humans. And these are humans who have been made illegal because of the fact that they have a lot of superior features to humans, and a lot of people were afraid of them. So 4 of them have escaped from an off-world colony where they had been living and managed to come down to Earth, where they are basically they're accused of wreaking havoc and all those sorts of things, when really they're just escaped trying to essentially meet their maker. So they're trying to track down the corporation who is responsible for their manufacture. And this is basically the reason why they're hunted down, is because of the fact that they have been made illegal on Earth. While they are legal in off-world colonies, they are illegal on Earth. So it's a job of a person like Deckard, for instance, to go hunting them down. And replicants, who are led by a man called Roy Batty, seek to gain access to Tyrell, who is the man responsible and whose corporation is responsible for them being made. And what they're trying to do is, by befriending those close to Tyrell, they're trying to get access to him and finding a method to extend their own lifespan. So that's basically the main thing to start with, is that's the reason they've come back to Earth, is because of the fact that they want to find a way to live longer. They only have a very short lifespan, and while they've been made in a way that they're superior to humans, what the result of that is that they are made their lifespan is a lot shorter. So this is the sort of thing that they're trying to extend, and trying to essentially have their own lives and be able to live a full and rich life. Okay, while hunting down the replicants, Deckard befriends another one, whose name's Rachel, who is, at the time when he first meets her, is an assistant to Tyrell, and she believes she's human, until Deckard starts to prove otherwise. So by revealing her true identity, and he does this through a photograph, which she claims is from her childhood, but really he confirms that it's come from someone else's memories, that they are implanted memories. He manages to convince her that what she remembers and what she thinks she knows has been taken from another person, another real life person, and is replacing basically her own memories, which she doesn't have because she is an artificial human. So this sort of thing is able to convince her, and he becomes he sort of befriends this lady in a very strange sort of sense, but a lot of the interactions between the characters are quite strange in this film, and the reason for that is because of the fact that they are really quite polarizing, particularly against each other, that a lot of their personalities do quite clash. And in this case, the fact that Deckard is accusing her of not being human is quite not a very nice way to start a friendship, I suppose, but particularly it's one of those things where he is able to convince her, and obviously that reality of that, the fact that she's not human, is one that's hard to accept. Now, methodically, and this is moving on in the film now, is Deckard hunts the replicants down, and he starts to track them down. He shoots Zora in the middle of a crowded shopping mall. And this is one of the very key scenes, particularly earlier on in the film. I know it's probably about halfway through, but it's one of those scenes that particularly shows the almost the savagery of Deckard's hunting, and particularly the sort of drama of her death as well. It's quite a very dramatic, and certainly starts to shift the empathy from the replicant, or from the human, to the replicants. And this is where we start to really actually feel more for them than we probably do for someone like Deckard, who is a bit of an anti-hero, or for the humans who have basically made these artificial people illegal. Leon, he also confronts, is shot by Rachel in order to save his life. So Rachel comes in and basically shoots Leon with Deckard's gun, and that's what saves him. Deckard vows to stop hunting her at this point, and he then falls in love with her instead, which I suppose is a pretty normal reaction. Alright, moving on in the film, Roy gets to Tyrell through J.F. Sebastian, who is basically a crazed designer who has an obsession with creating robotic company, who considers replicants kin because of the fact that he has Mufasa syndrome, which is basically premature aging. And because of this, he considers the replicants to be kin, and so he agrees to help them. And this does eventually get them access to Tyrell through Roy. So J.F. Sebastian introduces Roy to Tyrell, who believes that Tyrell might be able to do something to help him, which he doesn't. He has nothing to help him with. And that while he can't really extend their lifespan, he insists, and he basically goes into his final breath saying that he made them absolutely perfectly, and that everything that they had done was essentially perfect. They were the perfect sort of creations, except for the fact, and not excluding the fact, that their lifespan was quite short. And it was one of those sort of, it's better, and that classic line comes in, light that burns twice as bright but half as long. So this sort of idea is sort of, it doesn't get repeated, but it's one of those things that sort of stands out as a particularly key scene. Now, going further on in the story, this is where Deckard has now managed to hunt down the apartment of J.S. Sebastian, where Pris, who is one of the few remaining replicants with Roy, has basically taken refuge, and he kills her. And then beyond that, Roy arrives, and basically they have their final battle at the end of the film. He has given up hope of life at this point, or he knows now that he's not going to live. There's no way to extend his lifespan. He's killed Tyrell. He's killed J.F. Sebastian. There's no one left in his world now. So in the ensuing fight, and when Deckard is about to fall to his death, Roy saves him and delivers a monologue about basically his dying memories, which is a little bit ironic, seeing as you could argue those memories are implanted, and certainly the memories that he had post being made, basically ones which aren't exactly sort of pretty or bright or colourful, and yet he illustrates, or he talks about them in such a way in which they are. So those sorts of things sort of then again sort of re-emphasize this point that he is he's trying to feel like he's human. He's trying to feel like he's important and significant, and particularly Deckard watching him in the rain delivering his final words. He sort of starts to feel that he's connecting with him, and that basically through seeing Roy die, he's not experiencing that himself. Finally, upon return to his apartment, where Rachel is there waiting, he's greeted by Gaff, who congratulates him on a job well done, and then finally leaves behind an origami unicorn, which is a symbol, basically, as they are about to leave, that perhaps Deckard's own life isn't exactly what it seems, and that he could possibly be a replicant as well. And this is a point of great debate, whereas some people will tell you it is, and some people will tell you it isn't. The fact that there is that ambiguity at the ending is what makes the ending of the film quite classic. And that basically, through this suggestion, it sort of then starts to twist people's emphatic and basically their emotional connections to not only Deckard, but also to the replicants as well. So it starts to twist around people's feelings. And particularly the fact that Deckard is trying to emphasize that he is also quite human. The fact that he could be a replicant as well sort of throws a little bit of a twist in there and a bit of a spanner in the works. And what we get instead is we get this sort of ending where possibly Gaff has tapped into his dreams, tapped into his consciousness, and left this unicorn as a way of saying, I know what you really are, and I'm the one who has been able to access your memories and access basically what and who you are. So that's basically the film. So there are a lot of connections there between particularly the mortality of the replicants and certainly basically the hunting of Deckard and particularly the humans who are trying to basically track them down one by one and shoot them on sight. And this sort of idea is sort of given great emotional depth, particularly by Scott the director, as he basically puts characters and basically their interactions between characters are directed so that they are basically made to also almost feel the same. They're both very human. They're both trying to basically make the best out of a bad situation, to use the old cliche. All right, let's go into the context of the film, because this is a significant part, particularly of the making of the film, but also sort of influences a lot of particularly not only informatic issues, but also the technology that's used in the film as well. And the early 1980s really saw the rise of globalization. This is when TV had really entrenched itself into the family home. This is a time where people started to sample foods from different cultures. This is when Italian restaurants and Chinese restaurants had started to open up in cities. And this is a time where basically Western culture had started to infuse with others. And that made people a little bit paranoid, particularly at the time when Japanese culture and big companies such as Sony, who were developing things like the Walkman and the compact disc, were basically considered to be culturally taking over the world. And this Japanese technological rise meant that, well, at the time they felt that Japanese culture or Asian culture was really going to start taking over and influencing the West quite heavily. Which is why in the opening of the film you see a giant projection on a building of a Japanese woman. And there's essentially this sort of, and this continues in most of the cityscapes that you'll see. There's also an age where personal technology such as PCs, VCRs and compact discs are being introduced for the first time. These are all fairly basic, or particularly by today's standard technologies, but they are the start of not only home entertainment, but home computing, access to information, all of those sorts of things. Now, even though this is before the invention of the internet, this is still a time where information is spread a lot more quickly, and certainly reflects a time where technology is really starting to influence people's lives in such a way where people are basically able to live in society such as this, where mass culture and these sorts of things do exist. All right. And there's now also a growing awareness of environment issues as well, particularly when you see at the start of the film this very dystopian environment. It's sort of, I guess, painting a picture of what life would be like if we hadn't started introducing environmental legislation and we had allowed buildings and particularly factories to keep polluting as they were. So the environment that we see in the film is probably not one we're going to see in our lifetime. And that's because of the fact that a lot of environmental awareness had become basically available at that particular point in time. This mainly came from the 1960s and 70s, but it's something that really had grown by this time to a point where this dystopian future sort of reflected, I guess, the worst case scenario of what would happen if population growth went as quick as they thought it would. There's a self-awareness in the me generations in which everyone in the city is self-involved. There's very little interpersonal reaction between any of the characters, and particularly when you look at the city, everyone's got their head down, everyone's walking in a straight line, no one's looking at each other. So there's this sort of playing into this me generation where people are not paying attention to anyone else, which is something that you sort of see now, particularly with people walking around with headphones in their ears. And growing multinational corporate power. And this comes not only through a lot of advertising that's through the film, but also through the symbolic nature of the Tyrell Corporation, this giant pyramid that towers over everything else in the city, sort of shows that there's this growing, really significant corporate power. And the fact that this the Tyrell Corporation had such a giant influence, especially because of the fact that they created artificial life and artificial animals, sort of shows what having the capability to manufacture these things and having all this corporate power and influence is able to do. So if we're looking at this now and we're saying, well, how do we appropriate these ideas now? Obviously not all of these ideas will translate, and particularly some of the things that are depicted basically happening not long from now, is that some of them will not basically appear like that. So some of the questions and some of the ideas posed still remain valid questions. For instance, the tension in globalized society and debate of human versus the natural world is one that is still quite ongoing. And certainly we see, particularly with a huge push towards environmental awareness, even still continuing on, there's still the issue of humans damaging the world long term. And this is an issue that's raised in the film, and it's also an issue that's one that you can appropriate into this context. Environmental and corporate concerns have yet to dissipate. There's still the concern of the corporate monopoly. There's still the concern that through all these pressures that the environment may suffer, and these sorts of things as well. However, we don't have flying cars, and we probably won't for another at least 100 years yet. So that's probably one of the downsides, is we don't have the flying cars, and we don't have the sort of technology, or at least the range of technology that is available in the film. So if you're looking at that in terms of the actual film and looking at the sorts of things that have influenced it and its production, basically what you're looking at is a world where technology has really started to pick up, where a lot of the devices and gadgets that we take for granted now, we're starting to really come into the home. And this is sort of influencing this kind of world where cities are really built up. There's this really dark sort of film noir sense that the world, because of the heavy pollution and because of the societies in which are basically being built around these giant cities, basically being filled with pollution. And also the sense that there's this class divide between those who are living in poorer, polluted areas and those who don't. However, this is one that's probably not come, I guess, full circle as much as some of these other issues have. So that's basically it about the plot summary of the film and also the context in which it's made. But it's one of those things, just to have a look at the film, that you sort of just continue to keep an open mind. Obviously, you don't just dismiss things because of the fact that because this is a film that's trying to predict the future in some sense, that you don't look at and particularly don't focus too much on the things that they've got wrong. You focus a bit on the things that they've got right, and you also think about the things which create a very deep and thematic and emotional tapestry, which is mainly the main point of the film, is to sort of look at all these different I guess, ideas and themes which have come out of the film, particularly about what is natural and what is artificial, and the sort of the moral questions that are asked when you replicate a human and yet don't expect them to have human feelings. But that's basically it about or at least the context and also the summary of Blade Runner. Until next time, I'll see you later.